إنما هو التوحيد وتوحيد العبادة بالذات.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين أما بعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Welcome back to the next session on Islamic history being presented by the Tawheed Project. This session is, in a sense, a special session, a continuation from the main topic of Maghrazi Sira, which is listed as session 2. And the last session that we did was on the Isnad system, looking at the Isnad system from the Islamic perspective. We laid out the basic outline of what the Isnad system is, and more particularly why the Isnad system is so important in Islam. The whole transmission of Islam from the Sirah of Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, to all of the hadith, all of the aspects of Islamic belief, theology, the Sharia, Islamic law, everything is premised on the transmission of knowledge from the first generation of the Sahaba to the following generation of the Tabi'un, and then this continuing on up until the present. So the Isnad system in Islam is probably the most important in terms of the transmission of knowledge from this historical perspective, and very importantly from the theological perspective. We emphasized in the last session that the belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in His revelation, in the prophecy of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and in the unique status of the Sahaba, that this belief system is intertwined with the historical transmission of knowledge from the time of Sahaba on. So today we're going to take a look at what we call the authenticity question. This is based on modern or contemporary Western scholarship towards Islam, really stretching back 200, maybe 300 years, and what Western scholars of Islam have said about Islam in general, about the Quran, and particularly about the Hadith and the Isnad system. Right? So in this session we're going to review just in general what do we mean by Orientalism. This is the term that's used of those Western scholars who have studied Islam. Right? It's not a large group of people, but some very significant writings from the 19th century on have laid out the whole historical narrative from a Western perspective about what Islam is, how it developed, and how it was, the knowledge of Islam was transmitted. Right? The basic premise of Orientalism has been to malign the whole Isnad system. And this is what we're going to take a look at. Why is it in the interests of Western scholars to undermine the validity of the Isnad system? Because as we'll see, once you establish or try to establish that the transmission of knowledge from the Sahaba to the Tabi'un, second generation, to the Tabi'ut Tabi'in, third generation, is not a reliable, trustworthy transmission of knowledge, then you could undermine all of Islam. Right? And this is, of course, the aim of the Western scholars, is to devalue Islam, to reduce it to a obsolete religious system, right, that has no place in a modern world that, of course, is dominated by Western culture. Now, Orientalism, of course, is part and parcel of that larger Western culture. So what I want to do today is first take a look at what do we mean by Western culture. What are some of the underlying ideologies that have emerged in the West that have affected Western attitudes and policies towards the rest of the world. Of course, now a very important aspect is the emergence of the West from the 18th century up until today as the dominant power, colonial power, imperial power. Right? And this has not changed right up until today. And we'll take a look at a few of those points. But you have this whole issue of Western political, military, economic, cultural dominance, right? And it's had a tremendous impact on peoples all over the world. And in the Islamic world, it's meant that many, many Muslims, whether consciously, unconsciously, have come to adopt the Western historical narrative about Islam. And so you see Muslims today doubting the validity of the Sirah, doubting the validity of the Hadith, doubting the validity of the Sharia, all based on a blind adoption of this Western historical narrative. So we have to get an understanding, a handle on what do we mean by this Western culture, what is Orientalism, right? And then how has it impacted the way Western scholars over the past 200 years have dealt with Islam. So this is what we're going to take a look at. Now the influence of Orientalism, of course, goes way beyond the Islamic world. It has its impact in Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, Indian subcontinent, Asia. It's really something that has affected policies coming out of the West towards conquered people, colonized people, right? And continues right up until today. Now, this idea of Orientalism was probably most famously defined and presented in a book by that title, Orientalism, by the late Palestinian scholar Edward Said, who was for many years at Columbia University. When we look at, and I'm not going to go into detail of Said's book and his theories, it's a very elaborate book and it needs to be studied very carefully. But I want to just draw attention to the cover of his book. And this picture is a painting by Jean-Léon Gérôme, and it's titled The Snake Charmer. Right? And this is very, very typical of what we call Orientalist art. And I'm focusing on this because it's the art, in many ways, that portrays the thinking of the culture. Right? And you can go to websites, you can look at this Orientalist art. I gave some recommendations here from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The Heilbronn Timeline of Art History has a whole series of images of Western Orientalist art. Right? And two things that we could note in particular. The Orientalist art portrays the Arab world, the Islamic world, first of all, as something exotic and also erotic. You would see in this art really the product of the Western mind looking at the Islamic world in a very decadent manner, right? And very much related to aspects of sexuality that are, in a sense, fantasies of the Western mind imposed upon the Islamic world. The other aspect is the issue of Muslims as violent, Muslims as treacherous, right? And these two images come out in that Western art, right? So just looking at the cover of Edward Said's book really tells a whole story. Right? As we say, a picture's worth 1,000 words, and you get a real good understanding of that. Right? Now, Said really did a thorough examination of Western interaction with the Islamic world, right? And again, it's way beyond what we're going to be summarizing. But I didn't want to bring this up to make sure that people are at least aware of it, and you could get the book and you could look through it on your own. But this is where really the idea of Orientalism, right, is clearly defined, and we're using the term in this context, right, of Western scholars with their own biases and preconceived notions, creating a narrative about the Islamic world that has, and very often, little to do with the reality of the Islamic world, but it reflects the fantasies and imaginations that the Western scholars have about the Islamic world.
Orientalism, is it just the Islamic world, or was it also towards the rest of the
Yeah, Orientalism can be applied in a rather global sense. Right? It certainly would impact cultures outside of the Islamic world. Right? So in a sense, it's and this is what we're going to look at a little bit in the session here. It's a way of looking at other cultures, right? And very clearly and very intentionally demeaning these cultures, right? Looking at them as inferior cultures, right? In relationship to Western culture, because as the Western world expanded politically, militarily, economically, and colonized much of the world, and this is a historical fact. We can't deny or sort of turn our heads to that. So the West did emerge as this very powerful military, political, economic force that took over much of the world, from the 19th century going into the 20th century. And in the process, and this is what I want to get at, in the process, all aspects of Western culture, in the political, in the academic, the scholarly, the cultural, all aspects of Western culture looked at the rest of the world as an inferior race, almost subhuman. So Orientalism is going to vary in its particular approach and policies in sub-Saharan Africa or Asia, but the underlying understanding is that the non-Western, non-European, non-white, non-Christian world is inherently inferior. And so this is going to impact all of their scholarship, all of their writings, all of their understanding of what the rest of the world is. So this is what we're going to take a look at. And of course, we're focusing on the impact in the Islamic world in particular. So just in general here, in relation to the study of Islam, since the 13th, 19th century, Western scholars have declared the hadiths and the narrations from the early years of Islam to be nothing more than back projection and pious fraud, perpetrated by Muslim scholars of the 2nd, 8th, and 3rd, 9th century. So these two terms in particular, back projection. And what they're saying is, looking at the isnad, and we know that when we take a look at the isnad from the time of the great hadith collectors, Al-Bukhari, Muslim, Abu Dawud, Al-Nasa'i, Tirmidhi, Ibn Majah, and the others, the isnad does run backwards. It starts with Bukhari, and then he gives his teacher's name and the teacher of his teacher, and it goes back to the Tabi'un and back to the Sahaba, and then to Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Right? But what the Orientalist scholars are saying about back projection is that the Muslims of the 2nd century and 3rd century created these things. They fabricated these isnads. They fabricated the narrations, the matan, the actual narration, and they fabricated a chain of narrators from the 2nd and 3rd century going back. So whereas Muslims are looking at it as the list of names, right, that originate with Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who were the Sahaba who heard or saw and witnessed the event and passed that on, right, to the 2nd generation of Tabi'un. So the Islamic perspective, right, is that the chain of narrators is showing us how the true, correct information from the time of Muhammad ﷺ is passed on to reach Bukhari and Muslim and the others. Right? Whereas the Orientalists are saying this was a fabricated list of names, right, that had little or nothing to do with the reality of 7th century Arabia. So the claim is that the chain of narrators is fabricated, right, and that they were fabricated for the purpose of giving legitimacy to the religious claims or beliefs at the time of the 2nd century writers. So, for example, Imam Shafi'i would in a sense, create these chains of narrators. He had particular legal opinions, theological opinions. He wanted to sort of prove that these opinions are legitimate. He would then fabricate a chain of narrators and then put some narration claiming Prophet Muhammad says such and such, and then he would use this to prove that his opinion is correct, and that all the scholars of the 2nd century and 3rd century of Islam were fabricating these isnads, fabricating stories about Prophet Muhammad to present their religious opinions, or because of political issues that were going on, that people in government, caliphs, everybody was just running around fabricating stories, creating isnads, and then presenting these as legitimate. Right? So in a sense, it's a giant conspiracy theory that nothing of reality, nothing real or legitimate coming out of 7th century Arabia. In some cases, we'll see some Western scholars even reject the idea that Muhammad and the Muslims at the time had anything at all, and that Mecca was nothing, and there's almost, in a sense, no Muhammad. So this is what they were doing. Okay, so this is this. Well, yeah, the idea. I mean, one of the things we'll look at in Orientalism, and this is where Orientalism goes beyond the Islamic world. It's to undermine all local cultures, right, all local histories. Right? Nothing that the Chinese ever did was any good. Right? Nothing that in India was any good. Nothing in sub-Saharan Africa was any good. None of the cultures, none of the ideas, none of their beliefs, practices, histories, none of this was of any value. Right? And it's a very condescending attitude, because the understanding is only when the Western scholars came in, only when Western powers came in, that they will tell the Muslims what their history is. They will tell the Chinese what your history is. They will tell the people of Southeast Asia, here is who you are and what your history is. All right? So they take away the right or the legitimacy of the internal story. Right? So what Muslims have been telling themselves for 1,400 years is meaningless. Now the Western powers come in and they will tell us what our history is. Right? So it's this very condescending attitude. It's, again, based on the notion that non-European, non-Western, non-Christian cultures can never get it right. They don't understand anything. Right? And we're going to see some of the evidence for this as we go through. Finally, the other main point is that Orientalism is a clear accusation that the Sahaba and the Tabi'un were not trustworthy, pious men and women who accurately reported what they either experienced firsthand or heard from those who did. So the attack on the Isnad system is attack on the Sahaba. That they didn't know what they were doing. Right? They were liars. They made things up. Right? And we'll see some of the evidence for this. Right? Now, what I want to do is set up the broader context. Right? And so in order to understand Orientalism, we need to link it to the rise of Western power So we're going to give an overview of what this Western power is, and then view it in the light of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has revealed. Right? And I'm using just one verse as an example here. And this is from the story of Suleiman and Sheba, the queen of Sheba. And this is Surah 27, verse 34, where the Bilqis, the queen, is saying, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم قالت إن الملوك إذا دخلوا قرية أفسدوها وجعلوا أعزة أهلها أذلة وكذلك يفعلون. She said, indeed, kings, when they enter a city, they corrupt it and render the honor of its people humble, and thus do they do. Now, in a very brief tafsir here from Ibn Kathir, he reports that Ibn Abbas said, in reference to when they enter a city, they ruin it. That means kings enter a conquered territory, they corrupt it, meaning that they bring it to ruin. In reference to, and render the honored of its people humbled, Ibn Abbas says it means that the kings intend to humiliate the rulers and soldiers, either by killing them or taking them captive. Okay? And this is a very important verse to keep in mind. Particularly at the end, because one opinion about the verse is that the Queen's statement ends with وَجَعَلُوا أَعِزَّةَ أَهْلِهَا أَذِلَّةً, that this was her statement, and then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says وَكَذَلِكَ يَفْعَلُونَ, that Allah is, in a sense, stating that when kings go out and conquer territories, this is going to be the habit and the custom. And this is important to understand because this will happen constantly. So right up until today, and the point I'm making is that the behavior on the part of conquerors continues up till today with no change in policy, regardless of the proclaimed noble motives of the conquerors. Okay, so even if in a modern context, you see armies going out, you see Western powers invading other countries, claiming that they're bringing democracy, claiming they're doing this or that. And we could just look at the recent events in Iraq since the U.S. invasion in 2003. I mean, all the so-called noble claims of bringing democracy and going to liberate the people, and we're going to bring all sorts of benefits to the people. The reality is the U.S. went in and destroyed the country. And that's exactly what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says. Any conquered, any people who conquer, they're going to come in and they're going to destroy the institution, the structure that is in place. And so if we look at the Euro-American powers over the past 200 years, they've persisted unabated in trying to destroy the cultures and religions of colonized peoples. This can be seen in the continued attempts to impose Western values and norms on non-Western peoples. And here, I mean, it's not just the military, right? It's not just economic control, right? It's not just the control of agriculture and industry in a conquered territory, but this is also very much what we might call cultural wars. Right? Look at the impacts of Western culture all over the world. Look at the impact of Hollywood, movies, the moral ideas that come out. And you see people all over the world. You see Muslims all over the world. They know more about Hollywood movies than they know about who the Sahaba are.